Who are familiar with fellowships or sabbaticals, it means that a very generous group of donors paid for me to have a year of international experiences related to my grant proposal, which meant working with refugees. So my crazy idea a year ago, when I never thought this was going to happen, was I wanted to do what so many of us want to do. Get behind some of the stories of the refugee crisis internationally and then figure out how it connects to our lives right here in Washtenaw County. And the reality is that most of us can't leave our everyday lives to do this, and this is what I get to do. So I get to do this and come and talk to you about what I get to do. I've been to some of your churches, and I'm happy to come to your church if I haven't already. When I come to your church, I'm in full pastor mode. I talk a lot about my faith and the faith-based reasons why I think we should connect with refugees. But tonight, I'm going to instead talk about some of the best practices that we saw on the ground during our time in Europe. We really found a lot of things that were exciting and some things that were a little distressing in the ways that community networks in Europe are responding to the refugee crisis. So that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. But if I haven't been to your church and you want me to come, let me know. This is my blog, so if you want to follow what we're doing, you can help get onto that and you can be one of my followers. So this is what it looks like when you get to the page. So if you type that in, it doesn't look like this, you're in the wrong spot. This is me. This is what it should look like. So this summer, my husband David, who's recording me in the back, he's my main technical assistant, we got to travel to 12 different countries in Europe. We got to do a lot of different traveling and specifically work with refugee service organizations in 6 different locations. So a lot of you probably have been to Europe and have even been to some of the cities we've been to. So this is not the super fun where I show you 2,500 slides of all the places we went. But trust me, there's lots of funness on the blog. When you get really bored, you can scroll all the way back to the 1st of July. One of the things that really shocked me is that Europe has a history, a refugee history. We keep talking about how this is the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, and that so much of the refugee crisis is happening in Europe. That sounds crazy to us as North Americans, because geographically we don't have that happen a lot, right? But the truth is, Europe has a whole history of refugees. This is the Opera House in Oslo, and it's brand new, less than 5 years old, I think, and it's designed to look like a Viking ship. And this is me looking like a Viking in one of the cities, because a huge part of Scandinavian history has to do with refugees. The Vikings that went to Iceland, those were refugee Vikings. Those are the ones that couldn't, for some reason, continue living in Oslo or Stockholm. So they went off to this new crazy island and they hung there, and 1,000 years later they have a whole country called Iceland. So there's a big history of refugees in Europe. That's part of who they are. In fact, the most popular refugee is probably somebody you've heard of before. If you go to Amsterdam, you will spend all day waiting in line to get into the Anne Frank house because it is teeny weeny. What a lot of people forget is that Otto Frank, Anne's father, was a merchant in Germany. They're actually German. They were refugees in Amsterdam trying to escape the Nazi regime. And while they were in Amsterdam, the Otto Frank applied for refugee resettlement to the United States and was denied. And so it was only after the United States denied their refugee status for the US that they had to take their family into hiding in Amsterdam. After the family was taken out of hiding and most of them died, Otto Frank found Anne Frank's diary and published it, and it's super famous now. People want to go and see the Anne Frank house and hear her story. But it's really a refugee story. It's a story of how people have consistently looked for and found refuge in the cities of Europe. It's part of who they are as their history. These are some of the modern day refugees. These folks right here are young adults from Iran. And for any number of reasons, mainly religious ones, they felt that their government could no longer protect them. And so they are seeking refuge in a European country where they can worship freely and live freely. These two boys both talked about, I'm sorry, they're young men. These two young men both talked to me about how they heard stories from their grandparents about how women used to be treated well in their country and their sisters aren't. And they don't want to continue living in a place where their sisters are not given the rights they believe they deserve. There's only so many ways those men can stand up for the women in their lives, and one of those ways is to go to another country and tell their government, this isn't right, this isn't appropriate. So they're seeking refuge for reasons that we take for granted. The ability to worship freely, the ability to send your sister to school. These two guys are both from Afghanistan. They partnered with US military service people when we were there. And because of that, they've been targeted by the Taliban. They cannot safely live in Afghanistan anymore because they chose to be on our side. They don't have any regrets. They think that the United States was on the right side of justice at that time, and they long for the day when they can go back to their country as proud service people. But now's not that time. Unfortunately, these folks live in a country where they need to reapply every 6 months for refugee status. He's been in Norway for 13 years, since 2003. He was with the very first American invasion. Every 13 years, he's had to reapply every 6 months. It makes it very difficult for refugees to put roots in the community when you don't know if you're going to be here longer than 6 months. If 13 years ago someone told him he'd still be there today, he said he would have worked a lot harder when he first arrived to make sure that he was connected to the people that are there. These folks are still applying for asylum in Denmark, and until they get paperwork that says that they can be in Denmark long term, they're not very interested in learning Danish. The United States has a very different system. So this is something important to listen to, especially if you, like me in Ann Arbor, listen to some world news. When we talk about refugees in Europe, they use the word differently in Europe than we do in the United States. In the United States, someone who shows up here without legal paperwork is often referred to as an undocumented immigrant or as an illegal alien. Those are the two basic terms we use for folks who showed up without paperwork or who came with paperwork that expired, right? In Europe, they use the term refugee for anyone without paperwork who's seeking a safe place to stay. So anyone who enters a European country without permission to be in that country is automatically called a refugee while they apply for asylum. If they're granted asylum, then they can stay longer. The United States doesn't use those terms. We save asylum for very specific cases. The most popular one is Cubans. Cubans, as soon as they get one toe on American soil, are granted asylum. Because of that particular unique case, we reserve refugee for folks who've already been screened. So once the United Nations and the United States has screened you and given you permission to enter the country, you'll get a refugee visa. Well, it's officially a refugee status, but it's like a visa, kind of like if you're applying to be an international student at the University of Michigan, or if you got a job at Google, or some of our doctors are here on work visas. Just like those folks had to apply and get the paperwork before they could get on a plane, so do refugees to come to the United States. These folks didn't have that. They arrived in Europe without paperwork, and so Europe calls them refugees because they don't have paperwork. Those two definitions of refugee are important to know, and it's something that I ask you take out into the community and share. Because when we talk about the refugee crisis, people get scared because of millions of folks in Europe. We have that crisis in the United States at our southern border, and it's very important to talk about, but that's a completely different discussion for another day. Today we're going to focus on the refugees who've been given permission to come and resettle here. Those folks have gone through a 14-point screening process that takes at least 18 months. So just so you know that, when the North America talks about refugees, we're talking about folks who have permission to come and have been granted that permission. Some of them will be folks that have already been in Europe. Many of them will be folks directly from refugee camps. Because in order to get that special refugee status to come to the United States, you have to start with the United Nations. I thought this map was incredibly interesting. If you pay close attention, this is from a tourist brochure. This is for people like Ann Arborites, like me, that like pay good money, maybe not me, but like my fantasy me, that pays good money to go someplace and do a super cool tour. So when these countries aren't at war, it was really common to travel between Europe and the Middle East through Turkey. This has been common for centuries. It used to happen on foot, and then with camels and horses, and then with trains, and now with cars and planes. But this particular path has existed for a long time. There have been refugees or people in transit, people without official legal status, moving between these countries for a long time. And when you see how easy it really would be for someone like me with my kind of passport to travel between these countries, you start to understand why a lot of folks think it shouldn't be all that difficult for them to travel either. With my special American passport, I could go to all those places. It wouldn't be that hard. Maybe not Iran, but almost all those places for most of the world. So not a lot, but a significant chunk of refugees that end up in Europe have come this path somehow. Some of the folks, it takes years to get here. Some of the folks we met from Iran, it literally took them 2 or 3 years to get to this place. Because every time they crossed into a country, it was another waiting game. So, if you take this path, you might find yourself all the way up in Budapest. Budapest was one of the places where we found some of the worst practices. And so this is not great. I know a lot of you want to know what a refugee camp looks like in Europe, so here we go. David and I got permission to enter this refugee camp in Budapest. Camp is a loose term. From our perspective, it was more like a refugee prison. This is miles and miles outside of the city. This pastor right here, we had literally met 2 hours before, and he said, sure, hop in my car, I'll take you there. And we're driving for kilometers and kilometers outside of town. We looked at each other in the back seat, right around the time one of us took this picture, thinking to ourselves, I don't know, if we don't trust this guy, we are in deep trouble. Because he just drove us to literally the middle of nowhere, and there are armed guards on either side of this car. And they're going to give some paperwork, and if that paperwork clears, we're able to go inside of this fence, and then they will lock it behind us. And we have to stay in this locked area. So that's what it looked like to get into the refugee camp. In 2015, at the height of the refugee camp, each of these shipping containers held
16 men?
Right.
I think, yeah.
There are no windows, so they'd have to sleep with the door open, which means no security in order to sleep. They'd stack them 3 tall. This used to be used for like Bosnian, Serbian refugees in the early 90s. The way it looked like to me was kind of like the fairgrounds. You guys ever gone to like the Washtenaw County Fairgrounds or something like that? And you can kind of tell, like if it rains, the parking lot is really muddy, you kind of tell you're only really supposed to have a few people there a few days a year. The buildings were kind of like that. They were sort of designed to hold a few people. This building, which was the size of a small gymnasium, held several hundred people last year. When we came, most of them had been gone for a while. And so when we arrived, most folks were in these kinds of apartments. You can tell they're all locked and fenced. And when you come in, they're tiny little apartments. Probably 6 or 8 of them would fit into a room this size, so they're small. But each apartment would have a family staying in it. And that's where they could basically wait, because it's illegal to be a refugee in Hungary. You're not allowed to be there without paperwork. And so they are literally, this is where the reporters are kicking refugees, if you saw that on the news. This is where refugees are dying on the streets because you're not allowed to help them, they're not allowed to be there. So if they get stuck in Hungary without paperwork, they get taken to this detention facility to wait until they get some sort of paperwork. So this is not awesome and not fun. But this is the kind of situation that some of our folks are in. They're sitting here while they're waiting for their paperwork to be done. Oops. These are some of the folks we met. These 2 gals are from Congo. Their dad has not agreed to protect them from Boko Haram, and so they travel together. One of them is awake while the other one is asleep, so that they can protect each other as 2 women traveling alone. They were trying to get to Paris, but somehow ended up in Hungary, and now they're behind bars in Hungary. They're still hoping to get to Paris because they do hair. If you can tell, they look pretty nice for folks. And they offered to do my hair very nicely, but not that nicely. They offered to do my hair. I definitely needed some work, apparently, that day. This family down here is from Cuba. Believe it or not, they thought that flying to Moscow was their best way out of Cuba. So they flew into Moscow and then started walking into Europe. They tried to get to Germany, but ended up in Hungary. So they've now been imprisoned in Hungary for about a year and a half. Yeah, they'd like to get to the United States, so they're not teaching their daughter any Hungarian. They're hoping they're going to get her to the US. This family is from Afghanistan. They're a super young couple. They're an ethnic minority in Afghanistan, a particular group that the Taliban would like to eliminate. The Taliban is literally doing a Holocaust against this particular ethnic group. Now to us, they're all Afghanis, but to them it really matters. Most of the members of their family have been murdered by the Taliban in the last 10 years. And when her brother died in a protest, the same week that they found out Miriam was pregnant, they decided that was their chance to leave. So they started walking out of Afghanistan. And they kept walking. She lost her baby along the way. They got deported back to Afghanistan and they walked again. She became pregnant again along the way and had a stillborn baby. The doctor says it is the stress and it is the lack of bed rest. Those of you who've been pregnant know you probably don't want to walk 20 miles a day. And the lack of nutrition on the road. So they have been locked up here in Budapest for about 6 months when we were there. We showed up on the day that Mahmoud and Miriam had just received paperwork to legally leave the camp. And they were going to leave with their pastors that took us in. And those pastors had arranged for them to have a small apartment. This is a big deal. No one in Budapest will rent to a refugee. They think it might be against the law. And if it isn't today, they think it might be tomorrow. As soon as somebody gets in, they'll pass a law. So the church rented the apartment for them and helped get him a job cleaning dishes. And he is thrilled. He's pretty sure that if he gets a chance to work hard, then Miriam can be on bed rest. And their new baby will be raised in a country where he or she doesn't have to fear for their life. This is the dream that they're looking for. And even in a country that's imprisoned them for 6 months, they're still incredibly hopeful. If you don't come that route through Turkey, you might come this route. And you probably heard the stories about folks going on the boats. This particular route is no longer very popular this summer, but last summer it very much was. So you might take a boat and go through Athens. This route will take you several different places, hopefully getting to Germany. If you show up in Athens, you might show up and meet this lady, Bula. Bula is Greek. She loves being Greek. And if you want to think about, I was thinking my big fat Greek wedding Greek, that's her. She's super Greek. And she was going to feed me and talk to me, but only for 5 minutes because she's busy, lady. She's like, I don't know who you are from America, but I'm busy helping Greek people. So she gave me 5 whole minutes to talk about what she's doing. Bula is married to a Syrian. They've been married for a long time, long before the war. And because their children are half Greek and half Syrian, it turns out that their family speaks 2 really important languages in the midst of this refugee crisis, Arabic and Greek. She also speaks a little bit of English. And so what this means is that they have worked together to create this nonprofit center in Athens, Greece. A lot of tension is happening in Athens. It's a crazy place to be a refugee. The politics have gone back and forth. But what Vula, her husband, and her kids have been able to do, with help from North Americans, she told us. No one in Europe will help her because they don't want to get involved in politics. But North Americans are willing to help her because she is an independent-run nonprofit. She says, you Americans are all about helping us independent folks. So I said, yeah, we love independence. Yes, cowboys and all that. So we like to help her. Lots of North Americans are helping her out. She's created this really great, safe place across the plaza from a Greek Orthodox church that refuses to help. What they do is they have in their basement a food pantry and a clothes closet. She's running this the way we would run a lot of our homeless shelters. You show up when you're desperate. She'll give you a bag of food. She'll give you an outfit, a pair of shoes. They'll translate something, give you a hug, and make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. It's very much emergency aid. We do that really well in Washington County. For folks who need aid tonight, we're going to help you. But what she does specifically is she then takes the refugees that have been there a while, because this refugee crisis has been happening for 20 years in Greece. It got really bad a year or 2 ago. It's been happening for a long time. She'll use folks that are her relatives or friends of her husband's that speak Arabic. She'll use refugees that have already been there for a long time that speak Arabic and Greek. Those are the folks that meet them, not Greek people. Folks who speak their language will greet them when they walk in the door. And that person, in their language, will say, what do you need? How can I help? You're always welcome here. And she said, for about half the folks, they just want their bag of food and a new pair of shoes. But for half the folks, the reality is what they really need is a safe place to sit with their friends. It was really hot when we were there, so this is air conditioned. It was great. And they had cold water. I felt fantastic, personally. So she wanted to provide a safe place for these folks where they can come with their friends, where they can use Wi-Fi to apply for their asylum status, where they can talk to other refugees. Because she's starting a full-on counseling clinic with professionals in this place. They show up because of the immediate need, but she's responding to the fact that they have long-term needs. This kind of best practice makes a lot of sense to me here with refugees that are being resettled. The agencies work with them for their first 12 weeks on their really immediate needs. But what about the long-term welcome? What about the fact that once they've got their clothes and their shoes and their housing set up, what about the heart needs? What about the soul needs? What about making friends? What about feeling neighborly? She was able to start that conversation here. One of the reasons was by making sure she always had friendly people available. One of the ways was giving refugees a job, She said the young men she works with are bored because they're not allowed to work. So she puts them to work. She says, I got things to clean and food to pack and refugees to help. I'll work, yeah. She says they're not any different to her than her teenage sons. Keep them busy.